Welcome back, guys, to Fear Begins. In today's episode, I am sharing 7 true Appalachian forest horror stories that haunt the Blue Ridge. These are the chilling encounters locals whisper about and travelers never forget. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next terrifying upload. Do not forget to like and share this video with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Thank you all. Now let's begin. I grew up in Virginia, right at the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and my father raised me with a respect for the woods that bordered our town. He always said the Appalachian forests were different from anywhere else in America. Not just older, not just bigger, but alive in a way most people would never understand. I never took him seriously until the fall of 2014, when I decided to spend 3 days hiking through a stretch of trail that had a reputation even locals avoided. It started simply enough. I had just turned 25, and after a brutal breakup, I wanted space from people, noise, and reminders. The forest was supposed to clear my head. I packed light, a tent, sleeping bag, small stove, compass, map, and just enough food to keep me moving. I chose an old trail near Buena Vista, Virginia, one that wound high along the ridges before dipping deep into the valleys. The ranger at the outpost gave me a strange look when I signed in. He tapped the line of my route and said quietly, "Not many folks walk that side anymore. You hear things out there, just remember, it's the mountains home first. You're second." I shrugged it off with a polite smile, but his words stuck in my mind, even as I pulled my pack over my shoulders and stepped onto the path. The first day was perfect. The autumn leaves painted the slopes in fire, orange, red, gold, and the air was cool, sharp, and clean. I didn't see another hiker the entire day, which suited me fine. The silence was soothing, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant caws of crows circling overhead. I camped that night near a shallow creek. The water ran over smooth stones, singing in the dark while the wind whispered through branches above. I slept better than I had in months. But the second night changed everything. By late afternoon, the trail had dipped into a hollow so thick with trees that even in daylight, it felt like dusk. The canopy blotted out most of the sky, and the silence grew heavier, as though sound itself had trouble breathing down there. I set up camp near a half-rotted log, not far from a natural spring. Something about the place made me uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. My skin prickled, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder for no reason. Around midnight, I woke up to the faint crunch of leaves just beyond my tent. At first, I thought it was a deer. The Blue Ridge is full of them, and they wander close to campsites looking for scraps. But then I heard the sound again, slow, dragging steps. Too heavy for a deer, too deliberate. I held my breath, listening. The steps circled the tent, pausing now and then, like whoever or whatever. It was leaning close, watching me. Then came a whisper, low and broken. "Cold tonight, ain't it?" I froze. The voice was ragged, strained and wrong, like someone unused to speaking. Every word dragging out of a throat that had forgotten how to form them. I didn't move. My father's advice thundered back into my head. If you hear something in the woods that sounds human, but doesn't look human, you don't answer, you never answer. The footsteps shuffled away after what felt like an eternity. But I lay awake until dawn, clutching the handle of my knife inside my sleeping bag. The next morning, I forced myself to believe I'd dreamed it. Maybe it had been a hunter passing through. Maybe my imagination had twisted the rustle of leaves into a whisper. I pushed the thought down and hiked deeper into the hollow. That's when I began to notice the trees. Some of them were marked, not with carvings, not with ranger paint, but with long, deep gouges, claw marks almost. They ran high up the trunks, too high for any bear I'd ever heard of. The wood was stripped raw, sap bleeding in slow, sticky tears. I passed dozens of them, each one facing the same direction, like a trail of warnings leading me somewhere I wasn't meant to go. By late afternoon, I reached a ridge that overlooked the valley. I stopped to rest, setting my pack down near a cluster of boulders. That's when I saw it down below. Moving slowly through the trees was a figure at first. I thought it was another hiker, but something about it didn't fit. The limbs were too long. The body stooped like it carried invisible weight. Its skin, or what I could see of it, was pale, almost gray against the dark forest, and even from that distance, I could swear I heard it breathing, wet, labored like lungs full of water. I ducked behind the rocks and stayed still until the figure disappeared into the trees. My heart hammered, but I told myself I'd imagined it. Exhaustion, hunger, loneliness, they could twist your senses. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I'd been seen. That night, I set camp on higher ground, thinking distance might keep me safe. But sometime after midnight, I woke again. This time, the whisper came from directly beside my tent. "You're far from home." The voice was clearer now. Closer, I didn't dare look, but I saw the shadow through the thin nylon wall. A tall, crooked outline leaning in. I gripped my knife, every muscle locked. Then the shadow moved. It dragged itself away with a wet, scraping sound. Leaves crackled, then silence. At dawn, I unzipped the tent, and my stomach lurched. Surrounding my campsite were handprints in the dirt, dozens of them pressed deep into the soil. But they weren't normal hands. The fingers were too long, too many joints bending the wrong way. I wanted to turn back, but the map showed the nearest exit was still a full day's hike ahead. So I pressed forward, fast, barely stopping to eat or drink. The forest grew darker, the air thicker, like I was walking into something that resented my presence. By late afternoon, I heard the sound again. Breathing, not behind me, not ahead, but everywhere. Surrounding me, I spun in circles, but the woods looked empty. Then came the whisper, overlapping voices now, all straining, all broken. Cold tonight. Far from home, hungry. Panic surged. I broke into a run, branches whipping against my arms, roots clawing at my boots. I didn't stop until the trees opened into a clearing where an old fire pit lay half buried in moss. I collapsed there, chest heaving, praying for silence, but the silence didn't last. From the tree line, I heard the clicking. Slow, deliberate, like fingernails tapping on stone. Tap, pause, tap, closer each time. My vision blurred with tears, but I refused to move. Then, at the edge of the clearing, I saw it. The same figure from the valley, now clear in the dying light. Its face was wrong, stretched too long. The mouth cut from ear to ear, the jaw hung loose. Teeth small and needle sharp. Rows upon rows, it crouched low, limbs bending backward, watching me, and then it smiled. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because when I woke, I was lying on the side of the trail near Buena Vista, my pack torn open, map shredded, compass cracked. My body was scraped raw, but I was alive. A ranger found me stumbling down the path hours later. He listened to my story without interruption, his face grim. When I finished, he said only one thing: "You were lucky. The mountains don't let go easy next time. Don't come back alone." I never did. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the Appalachian forest is not what hunts you, but what waits for you to stumble into its place. Back in the fall of 1998, I was working for a survey crew hired to map out parcels of land that bordered the Blue Ridge Parkway in North Carolina. Most of my coworkers treated the job like routine. Long hours, long hikes, a paycheck at the end, but I loved it. I'd grown up close to these mountains, and walking them with nothing but a pack and a compass felt like home. One morning, the foreman split us into pairs to cover more ground. My partner, an older guy named Clay, had been doing this work for years. He was the kind of man who didn't spook easy, the kind who laughed at ghost stories and carried a flask to keep himself warm. When we were assigned a section deep off-trail near Craggy Gardens, he winked and said, "Hope you don't mind walking with the ghosts." We hiked for most of the day, pushing deeper into the woods than any trail marker reached. By late afternoon, the forest grew stranger. The trees twisted more tightly, their trunks scarred with black streaks that looked like fire damage but weren't. The undergrowth was sparse, as though the ground itself refused to grow anything. We came across a series of stone piles, cairns, set carefully in lines that didn't lead anywhere we could figure. Some were barely knee-high, while others stood taller than my chest. Clay knocked one over with his boot, chuckling. Locals probably playing games. Mountain folks like their spooks, but the moment he kicked it apart, the woods went still, dead still. No insects, no birds. The air thickened until it felt like we were underwater. Even Clay stopped grinning. "Guess we'll mark the point and get moving," he muttered. We tried, but that was when we realized our compass needles spun in lazy circles, no matter how we turned them. The GPS device Clay carried refused to get a signal. "That's strange," he said, though his voice cracked just a little. We decided to backtrack toward where we'd started, but after an hour of walking, the cairns returned. The same ones we'd seen before, the one Clay had knocked down, already rebuilt. Taller than before, I told him we needed to turn around again. To find another way, he muttered something about tricks of the light and hillbillies messing with us, but he looked rattled. As dusk crept in, the temperature dropped unnaturally fast. My breath fogged in front of me, and the trees seemed to close in tighter. We set up a quick camp, because hiking blind was a recipe for a broken ankle, or worse. The fire we built barely seemed to catch. Even with dry wood, the flames wavered weak and blue. Clay sat close, flask in hand, muttering curses at the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. The trees weren't just trees anymore. They leaned toward us as though listening. Sometime after midnight, a sound woke me. It wasn't footsteps exactly, more like the scrape of stone against stone. I opened my eyes and froze. Around our camp, the cairns had returned. Dozens of them circling the fire, each stacked perfectly. And they hadn't been there when I'd closed my eyes. Clay cursed, standing up fast. "All right, whoever's out there, you had your fun," he yelled into the darkness. His voice cracked like brittle wood. The scraping continued, slowly, deliberately. A new cairn built itself on the edge of the firelight. Stones lifted from the ground and stacked one by one, as if invisible hands were building it. Clay staggered back, eyes wide. I whispered, "Sit down, don't move." But he didn't listen. He rushed forward and kicked at the half-built pile. That was when the woods screamed. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't human. It was a noise that came from everywhere at once, high and low, like hundreds of voices crying out in rage. The fire snuffed out instantly, plunging us into blackness. I fumbled for my flashlight, shaking hands, barely holding steady. When the beam finally cut through the dark, Clay was gone, just gone. His pack, his flask, even the ground where he'd stood. Empty. The cairns, however, were taller now. Each one stretched upward, stone after stone stacked impossibly high. My light caught on one nearest me and my stomach turned. Wedged into the stones at its center was Clay's flask. I ran. I didn't pack my gear. I didn't care about the compass. I just ran through the dark, crashing through undergrowth, branches tearing at my arms. The forest shifted around me, paths curving in directions that made no sense, but somehow I stumbled back to the edge of the Blue Ridge Parkway by dawn, filthy, bruised, and shaking. When I tried to tell the foreman, he looked at me with tired eyes. "Clay's walked those woods longer than you've been alive," he said. "If he didn't come back, it means the mountain wanted him. You'd best be grateful it didn't want you too." They filed the report as lost hiker, presumed dead. No search party lasted more than a few hours before giving up. They claimed the terrain was too rough, but I've never stopped wondering if that was the truth or if everyone already knew. I've never gone back to Craggy Gardens, and I never will, because I still dream of those cairns building themselves one stone at a time, waiting for me to come back and finish what they started. They say the Blue Ridge holds secrets buried deeper than the roots of its oldest oaks. And I learned just how true that was when I took a job as a caretaker for a remote lodge tucked against the edge of Pisgah National Forest. It was late October, the kind of season where the mountains burn with color by day and the nights fall bitter cold. The lodge was small, more of a retreat house for hunters and hikers than anything fancy, and the owner wanted someone to stay over the winter to keep pipes from freezing, roofs from sagging, and trespassers from squatting. The pay wasn't great, but the solitude called to me. After years of city noise, I thought the mountains might finally let me breathe again. The first few weeks were simple. I stacked wood, checked the furnace, and made occasional hikes down to the nearest town for supplies. Every evening I'd light the fireplace and sit listening to the wind press against the old windows. Sometimes coyotes yipped in the distance, or owls hooted low from the trees. Normal mountain sounds, comforting in their own way. But then one night I woke to something else. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal, it was music. Faint, eerie, like a fiddle playing a tune I didn't recognize. The notes carried soft and thin through the trees, rising and falling in a pattern that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I sat there in the dark, frozen, listening. It wasn't coming from the road, it was coming from the forest, by morning. I convinced myself I'd dreamed it. Isolation does strange things to the mind. But when dusk came again, the sound returned. The fiddle, scraping out its strange melody. Only this time there were voices too, low, humming, keeping time. I stepped onto the porch, my breath fogging in the cold. The sound floated from the hollow behind the lodge, weaving through the bare trees like smoke. I couldn't see anyone, not a lantern or flashlight. Just that mournful tune and the humming chorus. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I walked into town and asked an old hardware clerk if folks ever played music up in the hollows. Maybe teenagers trying to spook each other. He gave me a look I still remember, sharp and uneasy. If you're hearing fiddle music in them woods, son, you stay inside, don't matter what it sounds like. You keep your doors locked tight, I pressed him. But he just shook his head. Ain't my story to tell, just remember. The mountains got players you don't want to dance with. That night, the music came again, closer this time. The fiddle was sharper, the rhythm stronger, and the humming had grown into voices singing now, though the words didn't match any language I knew. The air inside the lodge trembled with it, like the walls themselves were vibrating. I tried to drown it out, stuffing pillows over my head, but the sound pressed through everything. Then came the knocking, slow, deliberate, against the back door. Knock, knock, knock. I crept down with a lantern, heart pounding. Through the window I saw nothing but darkness. The knocking stopped, replaced by whispers sliding across the glass. Come out. The dance is starting. I backed away, clutching the lantern, and the voices faded with laughter that sounded too hollow, too old. The fiddle played on, a twisted invitation. The next morning, I found tracks in the frost outside the lodge. Bare footprints, dozens of them, circling the house, each one pressed deep into the ground, though no snow had fallen heavy enough to explain it. The prints were long, the toes splayed too wide, almost like claws. I wanted to leave. I should have packed and walked the 20 miles back to town. But something about the lodge held me. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe the foolish belief I could outlast whatever haunted the woods. For a few days, the music stopped. I let myself hope it was over, but then, on Halloween night, the fiddle began again, louder, stronger. The voices rose in a chorus, laughing, weeping, singing all at once. The walls shook, the windows rattled, and from the back door came a new sound, scratching, deep and insistent. As though nails were carving into the wood, I lit every lamp, every candle, filling the lodge with trembling light. The scratching grew frantic, and then the door handle began to turn. Slowly, carefully, back and forth I shouted, "Leave me alone!" My voice cracked, desperate for a moment. Everything stopped. The fiddle cut off mid-note. Silence fell so deep it roared in my ears. Then, from just beyond the door, a single voice whispered, clear and sharp, "One more song." The fiddle shrieked to life again, violent and furious, and the voices screamed along with it. I stumbled back, covering my ears, until, just as suddenly, it ended. Silence, utter silence. When dawn came, the lodge was still. The door bore deep scratches, carved into patterns that looked almost like symbols. Twisting shapes burned into my memory. I left that morning, abandoning my gear, my paycheck, everything. I walked until my legs gave out and flagged down a passing truck on the parkway. I never returned, though I've heard since then that no caretaker stays at that lodge longer than a month. And sometimes, when the nights are very still, even in town, folks swear they hear a fiddle drifting down from Pisgah's hollows, a song that doesn't belong to any living hand. Locals often say the Blue Ridge is alive, not in the way of forests filled with deer and black bears, but in a way that watches, listens, and waits. I used to laugh at such talk. That was before I met the woman on the ridge above Craggy Gardens. It was early November and the trail was nearly empty. Most hikers had packed away their gear for the season, leaving the mountains to those willing to face biting wind and early dusk. I loved those quiet hikes. The bare trees opened long views across rolling valleys, and the crisp air sharpened every sound, wind threading through branches. Crows calling from rocky outcrops that afternoon. The light dimmed faster than I expected, shadows pouring down the slopes like ink. I was still a mile from the trailhead when I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I assumed another late hiker had fallen into the same mistake. But when I glanced back, I froze. A woman stood just beyond the bend, half shrouded by the fading light. She wore a pale dress that looked wrong for the cold. its hem torn and muddy, her hair hung loose, dark strands whipped by the wind. What caught me hardest, though, was her stillness. She didn't shift or adjust her stance. She just stood, staring straight at me. "Evening," I called, my voice thin in the empty woods. "Trail's about done this way." She didn't answer. I hurried on, the crunch of my boots loud against the silence. After a few minutes, I dared another look back. The trail was empty, relief washed over me, until I rounded the next curve and saw her again. She was closer now, only 30 feet behind, in the same pale dress, her head tilted slightly as though studying me. My pulse spiked, I quickened my pace, nearly jogging, but every bend revealed her again, always the same distance. Always standing, never walking, never speaking. The air grew colder as the trail narrowed between thickets of mountain laurel. Branches scraped my arms as I pushed through. And the whole time, I could feel her eyes burning into me from behind. Finally, I broke into a small clearing where the ridge opened to a view of the valley. I paused, desperate to catch my breath. That was when I heard her voice. "You should not be here." It came soft but sharp. Cutting through the wind like a blade, I turned, and she stood at the far edge of the clearing. Dress snapping in the gusts, her face was pale. Lips almost blue, but her eyes were hollow, dark sockets deep and endless, as though something had scooped the soul clean out of her. My legs nearly buckled. I forced myself forward, stumbling down the trail. The trees closed in again, swallowing the ridge. Every step I expected her hand to seize my shoulder, to drag me into the dark. When I finally burst from the woods into the gravel lot of the trailhead, night had fallen. My car was the only one there. Silver in the moonlight, I yanked the door open, jumped inside and locked it. But as I fumbled with the keys, a reflection flashed in the rearview mirror. She sat in the back seat, that pale dress, that hollow face, her head cocked as if curious. The cold rushed over me, sinking into my bones. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Then, just as I opened my mouth to scream, she whispered again, this time so close the words brushed the back of my neck. "Do not come back." I blinked, and the seat was empty. I drove until I reached Asheville, headlights cutting wild through the night. I swore I'd never set foot on that ridge again. Months later, in the warmth of spring, I broke that vow. Curiosity gnawed at me. I told myself it had been stress, exhaustion, some cruel trick of isolation. I hiked up to Craggy Gardens again, beneath blooming rhododendron. The trail was crowded now with families and tourists, laughter echoing off the slopes. For a while it felt safe, ordinary. But when I reached that same clearing on the ridge, I froze. There, carved into the bark of an old oak at the edge, were words etched deep by something sharp. "Do not come back." The letters looked fresh, the grooves pale and raw. No one around me seemed to notice. They walked on, chatting, snapping photos, breathing the mountain air. But I stood there, unable to move, staring at that warning. The woman had kept her word. And though I left that day under the bright sun, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night certain I'll find her again, waiting, watching, whispering from the shadows of the Blue Ridge. The mountains hold many stories, but some are whispered only when the fire burns low and the night presses hard against the cabin walls. One of those tales follows me still, years after I first heard it from a hunter near Mount Mitchell. He told me about an old trail that doesn't appear on maps, a narrow path that winds off the main ridge and disappears into a ravine so steep it feels more like a scar than a valley. Most locals call it Hollow Step, though nobody agrees where the name comes from. Some say it's because footsteps echo strangely there, hollow and distant, even when you're alone. Others believe the ground itself is empty beneath, as if the earth refuses to hold the weight of what lingers. Curiosity is a dangerous thing. I let it guide me there one cold March evening, when the forest was still leafless and the ground brittle with frost. I found the split in the trail almost by accident, half hidden by laurel thickets. The entrance was narrow, dark, as though the woods themselves were reluctant to show me the way. I stepped inside, and at once the air changed. The wind died, sound folded into silence. My own footsteps seemed muffled, swallowed before they could echo the world behind me. The faint chatter of other hikers, the smell of pine smoke from campsites, vanished as though I'd crossed an invisible threshold. The descent was steep, the path littered with jagged rocks. At the bottom lay the ravine, a place untouched by sunlight even at midday. Thin streams of water trickled down moss-slick walls, gathering in a pool so dark it looked bottomless. The air smelled of iron and something older, something that raised the hair on my arms. That was when I noticed the carvings. Trees along the water's edge bore strange marks, not initials or crude graffiti, but symbols I couldn't recognize: spirals, jagged slashes, crude stick figures with arms bent at impossible angles. They circled the pool, dozens of them, some fresh, some so weathered the bark had healed around the grooves I should have turned back. Every part of me screamed that I was trespassing where no one should stand. But the pool drew me closer, its surface too still, too perfect. It reflected the trees like a sheet of black glass, though when I leaned over, my own reflection wasn't there. Instead, another face stared up. A gaunt figure, skin as pale as moonlight, eyes hollow pits like deep caves. Its mouth stretched into a grin too wide. Teeth needle-sharp, I stumbled back, heart pounding. The surface rippled, as though disturbed by breath rising from below. Then the smell hit me, rot, wet and thick, curling into my nose until I gagged. I fled the ravine, clawing my way up the path, branches whipping against my arms. The silence broke at last when I reached the main trail. Wind roared through the trees again, birds cried overhead. It was as if Hollow Step had spat me out. I told myself I'd imagined it, shadows, exhaustion, some trick of water and fear. But that night, lying in a rented cabin miles away, I woke to the sound of dripping water. I sat up, heart hammering, and saw the pool again. Not outside, not in the woods, but in the reflection of the darkened window across from my bed. The black water rippled, and that same pale figure leaned close, its mouth stretching, whispering words I could almost, but not quite understand. I turned on every light in the cabin. Still, the dripping continued. By dawn, my clothes smelled faintly of iron and rot. Though I hadn't left the bed all night, the hunter's words came back to me then, his eyes sharp under the brim of his cap. If you step into Hollow Step, don't drink the water. Don't even look too long. It remembers faces. And once it's seen yours, you'll see it again. Whether you want to or not, years have passed since that night, yet I still wake sometimes to the faint sound of dripping water. I keep the windows covered now, but I know that reflection waits on the other side. The face in the pool remembers me, and I fear the day it climbs free of the glass. The mountains hold secrets older than memory. Some say the Blue Ridge is alive, its valleys and ridges pulsing with spirits that were never laid to rest. That was the whisper that lingered in Clara's ears the night she set up camp alone deep in the forest. She had hiked the Appalachian Trail before, always with friends, but this trip was different. She wanted to prove to herself she could survive the woods on her own. She found a clearing not far from a stream, pitched her tent and built a small fire. The sun was setting behind the peaks, the light sinking into purple shadows. Clara sipped from her canteen and told herself she felt safe. But the woods did not agree. The air had a heaviness to it, as though the trees themselves leaned closer to listen every so often. She thought she heard a footstep in the undergrowth, but when she turned, her firelight revealed nothing. She laughed nervously and blamed her imagination. Still, she kept her knife close. By midnight, the fire had burned low. Clara lay in her sleeping bag, listening to the stream, trying to ignore the forest sounds. That was when she heard the first whisper. It was faint, like a breath sliding between the trees. She sat up, straining her ears. The whisper came again, clearer this time, and it carried her name. Her throat tightened. She unzipped the tent and peered into the dark. The fire was nearly gone, only embers glowing beyond the light. The forest was pitch black. She thought she saw movement, the outline of a figure, but it vanished when she blinked. Clara forced herself back inside, convincing herself she was tired. But the whispers did not stop. They grew, overlapping, like a chorus of voices circling her tent. Her heart hammered, and she gripped the knife so tightly her hand ached. Then something pressed against the tent wall. The fabric caved inward, the shape of a hand pushing from outside. She froze. Another hand joined it, and then another, until the tent sagged under the weight of countless unseen figures pressing in. She slashed at the fabric, but when the blade tore through, there was nothing. No hands, no bodies, only night air spilling inside. She scrambled out, stumbling into the clearing. The fire had died completely, leaving her in near darkness. Her flashlight beam cut through the trees. And that was when she saw them, dozens of figures, pale and silent. Standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, their eyes glowed faintly. Reflecting the light like glass, they did not move, but their presence was suffocating. Clara backed away, her breath ragged. She whispered, "Stay back." But the figures stepped forward in unison. Slow and deliberate, she turned and ran, crashing through the forest. Branches whipping her face, the voices followed, rising in a deafening chant, her name over and over, twisted in tones both familiar and strange. She tripped and fell, her flashlight flying from her hand. When she scrambled to her feet, the light illuminated a shape ahead. A small wooden church, rotting but intact, hidden in the woods like a forgotten grave. Desperate for safety, she bolted inside. The pews were broken. The altar collapsed, but the roof held. She slammed the door shut, her chest heaving. For a moment, the voices dimmed. She thought maybe she had escaped, but then the air grew cold. Frost crept along the broken windows, and the wooden walls groaned. A shadow rose from the far end of the church, tall and formless, its edges bleeding into the air. Clara's knife shook in her hand, but she knew it would be useless. The shadow moved closer, its presence pressing against her chest like a weight. She backed against the altar, tears streaming down her face. "What do you want from me?" she cried. The shadow bent low, and though it had no mouth, she heard the words clearly. "You came alone. Now you are ours." The floor gave way beneath her. She screamed as the rotted boards collapsed, dragging her into darkness. Days later, hikers found her campsite. The tent was shredded, her gear scattered. They searched for her, calling her name into the valleys, but there was no trace. Only the church remained, silent and still, as if it had been waiting for its next visitor. Locals say if you hike near that ridge at night, you can hear a woman's voice calling for help. Some believe it is Clara, trapped between the living and the dead. Others say it is the forest itself, luring the next traveler into its grasp. Either way, the warning is the same. Do not camp alone in the Blue Ridge, because the forest does not forget who steps into its shadows. And if you do, when the whispers start, it may already be too late. There are trails in the Blue Ridge that even seasoned hikers avoid. Paths where compasses spin and shadows fall too early. One of those trails wound its way along a ridge known locally as Widow's Spine. Few maps marked it, and those who knew it existed said it was cursed ground. But Caleb and his cousin Mason were not the kind to believe old mountain stories. It was late October when they set out, backpacks heavy with supplies, eager to push deeper into the wilderness than they ever had before. The forest canopy was aflame with color, reds and oranges painting the slopes, but the deeper they went, the more the leaves seemed to wither, as if autumn had come and gone too quickly in that part of the mountain. They hiked for hours, their laughter bouncing between the trees, until the path narrowed along the ridge. To their left, the slope fell steep into shadow. To their right, the land rose in jagged rock. The trail itself was little more than dirt and roots, worn thin by weather rather than footsteps. Mason, always the skeptic, pointed out how the silence pressed in. "Feels like a graveyard," he joked. Caleb only nodded, though he felt the same unease by dusk. They reached a clearing where they decided to camp. They set up their tents, built a small fire, and cooked a meal. The ridge overlooked a valley that stretched into darkness, and for a moment the sight was breathtaking, but as night fell, the beauty drained away. The fire seemed weaker than usual, as if the flames struggled against the air itself. The woods around them grew unnaturally still. Caleb shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the shadows. "Something's off," he muttered. Mason rolled his eyes. "It's just the wilderness. You watch too many scary movies." But when they crawled into their tents, neither could sleep. A low hum drifted through the night, soft at first, like the wind caught in a hollow log. Then it grew louder, shaping into what sounded like voices. Caleb sat up, listening. The sound came from the valley below, a rising and falling chant, foreign and unsettling. He unzipped his tent and peeked out. Mason was already outside, staring into the dark. "You hear it too?" Mason asked. Caleb nodded, his stomach tightening without a word. They grabbed their flashlights and crept toward the ridge. The valley below was black, but in the distance faint lights flickered, like torches swaying in unison. Figures moved between them, dozens, maybe hundreds, forming a circle in the clearing below. "What the hell?" Mason whispered. The chanting grew louder. Carrying up the ridge, the figures swayed, arms raised, their movements perfectly synchronized. At the center of the circle stood something massive, a shape taller than any man, its outline jagged and wrong, as if it had too many limbs. Caleb felt his knees weaken. "We need to go," he hissed. But Mason's eyes were locked on the scene. What if it's just some kind of reenactment? Or a ritual? Ritual? Caleb snapped. "That's not normal." Before they could argue, every torchlight below went out at once. The chanting stopped, leaving only silence. Then, one by one, dozens of glowing eyes opened in the darkness. Staring up at the ridge, the cousins froze. They could feel the weight of that gaze pressing against them. Then came the sound of movement, hundreds of feet pounding the ground. Rushing toward the base of the ridge. "Run!" Caleb shouted. They tore back through the woods, branches ripping at their clothes. Behind them, the forest erupted with noise, shrieks, guttural cries, the snapping of trees as something massive moved with impossible speed. Mason stumbled, falling hard onto the trail. Caleb turned back, grabbing his arm. "Get up!" he screamed. But before Mason could stand, a shadow burst from the trees, slamming into him. The flashlight beam caught its shape for a split second. A body twisted backward, its joints bending the wrong way. Its mouth stretched in a silent scream. It dragged Mason into the dark before Caleb could fire the flare gun he carried. Panicked, Caleb fired the flare into the air. The burst of red light illuminated the ridge, revealing dozens of figures scaling the slope, their eyes glowing, their bodies crawling unnaturally fast. Like insects, Caleb ran, his lungs burning, tears streaming down his face. He did not stop until he stumbled onto a logging road, collapsing in exhaustion. When rescuers searched the ridge the next day, they found his camp torn apart, Mason's belongings scattered. Of Mason himself there was no sign. Caleb refused to speak of what happened, only repeating the same warning. The valley takes who it wants. Locals say Widow's Spine has always belonged to the dead. Long before settlers came, the ridge was used for rituals, offerings to something that lived beneath the mountain. And sometimes, when the wind is right, hikers claim they hear the chanting drift up from the valley, luring them closer. No one who has gone down into that hollow has ever returned. So if you find yourself walking a trail where the trees lean too close and the silence feels heavy, remember the story of Caleb and Mason, and whatever you do not stop to listen when the chanting begins, because once you hear it, you are already being called. In the Blue Ridge, there are hollows the sun seems to forget, places where daylight fades too quickly and shadows linger long after dusk. One such place lies at the end of a dirt road that has not seen proper use in decades. The locals call it Ash Hollow, and they warn newcomers not to wander too far in. Most who heed the warning live to tell the tale. But for Jenna, curiosity was stronger than caution. Jenna was a photographer from Asheville who had grown tired of capturing the same mountaintop vistas tourists flocked to. She wanted something raw, something untouched. A local she met at a diner mentioned Ash Hollow offhandedly, describing it as beautiful yet strange. A place where the trees seemed older than time itself. The way he said it made her skin prickle, but it also sparked her determination. She drove out one October afternoon, the road twisting deeper into the forest until her GPS went blank. By the time she reached the hollow, the air had grown cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth. The trees here were massive, their trunks gnarled and scarred, their branches forming a canopy so thick the sky was little more than a pale blur. Jenna parked at the side of the road and grabbed her camera. The forest swallowed the sound of her footsteps as she walked, her boots crunching against a bed of leaves that seemed darker than the season should allow. Every few steps, she paused to take pictures, twisted branches, strange claw-like roots, a hollow tree split wide like a screaming mouth. She told herself the odd atmosphere was just her nerves, but as she went deeper, she noticed carvings etched into the bark of several trees. Some looked like symbols, others like words in a language she could not recognize. She snapped a photo of one and whispered to herself. Probably kids messing around, but her voice seemed too loud, echoing faintly in a way it should not have. An hour passed before she reached the heart of the hollow. The ground dipped into a shallow basin, and in its center stood a massive stone slick with moss, its surface carved with patterns that spiraled and twisted. Jenna's pulse quickened as she raised her camera. This was it, the kind of image that could define her portfolio. She circled the stone, snapping photos from every angle. The air grew colder, her breath visible though the day was mild. A faint sound drifted through the trees, like whispers carried on the wind. Jenna froze, turning slowly. No one was there. She lifted her camera again, and through the lens, she saw something move behind the stone. She lowered it quickly, but the clearing was empty. Her heart thudded painfully. She told herself it was her imagination, maybe a deer. Still, she decided it was time to leave. But when she retraced her steps, the trail no longer looked familiar. She walked faster, scanning the trees for landmarks. But the carvings had changed. Where once there were spirals, now there were crude faces etched into the bark. Faces with hollow eyes and wide, jagged mouths. Her breaths came quicker. She pulled out her phone, but it was dead. Though she had charged it fully that morning, the whispers returned, louder now. Distinct voices speaking in a language she could not understand. They seemed to come from all around her. She spun, snapping photos blindly, the flash briefly lighting the trees. In those brief bursts of light, shapes flickered in the distance, tall, thin figures standing between the trunks, motionless. "Hello," she called out, her voice cracking. No reply came, only silence. She began to run, tripping over roots, her camera swinging against her chest. The forest twisted around her, paths splitting where none had been, trees leaning in closer. She turned left, then right, each time ending up deeper in the hollow. Panic clawed at her throat. Finally, she stumbled into another clearing. At first, relief flooded her, until she realized it was the same clearing as before. The stone loomed in the center, but now it was different. The carvings had shifted, forming faces that seemed to leer at her, their mouths open in eternal screams. And standing atop the stone was a figure. It was tall, its limbs impossibly long, its body draped in what looked like tattered cloth made of shadows. Its head was nothing but a skull-like mask, antlers branching from its crown. The whispers rose into a deafening chorus as it turned its hollow gaze on her. Jenna stumbled back, her scream caught in her throat. The figure lifted one hand, bony fingers curling, and the ground trembled beneath her. Roots erupted from the soil, snaring her ankles, pulling her toward the stone. She struggled, clawing at the earth. But the roots held fast. Her camera, still hanging from her neck, flashed as it hit the ground, capturing one final photo, the figure looming above her, its antlers framed against the dark canopy. The next day, Jenna's car was found abandoned at the edge of Ash Hollow. Her camera lay on the driver's seat, the memory card filled with dozens of photos of the forest. But the last image was different. It showed her sprawled across the stone, her mouth open in a silent scream, while behind her, dozens of shadowy figures crowded the clearing, their faces twisted in grotesque grins. Of Jenna herself there was no sign. Locals say Ash Hollow was once a place of sacrifice, where the earliest settlers bargained with something they could not understand. The carvings are older than memory, etched into the bark by hands long gone. They say the hollow chooses who it keeps, luring them deeper until they cannot find their way out. And sometimes, when a photographer or hiker goes missing, the sheriff refuses to search the hollow, muttering the same warning: Ash Hollow does not give back what it takes. So if you ever find yourself wandering the Blue Ridge, and you see carvings on the trees that shift when you look away, do not follow them. Do not seek the stone, because the hollow is always hungry. And once you step into its basin, you belong to it. Some places in the Blue Ridge are haunted not by ghosts, but by the weight of history itself. Places where blood soaked the soil so deeply that it never washed away. One such place is a stretch of old logging land near Bent Creek. Abandoned after an accident decades ago, locals whisper that the land remembers what happened there. And it does not forgive trespassers. Ethan, a forestry student at Western Carolina University, had heard the stories but dismissed them as superstitions for his senior project. He wanted to study regrowth in areas once stripped by heavy logging, and the Bent Creek tract offered untouched data. He convinced his friend Lisa to come along, promising they would only camp one night and return with enough information to fuel his paper. They hiked in late one afternoon, the air crisp with the bite of early November. The forest felt alive, every gust of wind rattling through dry branches, every crackle underfoot echoing too loudly. Lisa noticed first that the ground seemed unusually dark, almost black in patches, as if something had stained it long ago. Ethan waved it off, saying soil composition varied, but the explanation sounded hollow even to him by dusk. They found the remnants of the old logging camp, rusted equipment half buried in earth, rotting beams that once supported cabins, and a broken saw blade taller than Ethan himself. The place reeked faintly of iron, a metallic tang that clung to the back of their throats. "Smells like blood," Lisa muttered. Ethan laughed nervously. "More like rust." They set up their tent near what had once been the mess hall, its stone foundation still intact. A fire crackled to life, casting long shadows across the ruins. They ate quietly, both too aware of the silence pressing down on them. No crickets, no owls, just the fire and the occasional creak of wood that should not have been standing. As night deepened, Lisa grew restless. She swore she heard faint chopping sounds in the distance, rhythmic and steady, like an axe splitting wood. Ethan strained to listen but heard nothing. "Probably branches breaking in the wind," he said. But the air was still. They crawled into the tent, but sleep would not come. Around midnight, Lisa shook Ethan awake. "Listen." This time he heard it too. The sound of men's voices carried faintly through the trees. Not one or two, but many, rising and falling in rough conversation. Then came the chopping again, in unison now, as if dozens of axes struck at once. Ethan's rational mind fought against panic. "There's no one out here," he whispered. But the voices grew louder, nearer, until they seemed to circle the tent. Shadows moved against the fabric. Silhouettes of men in wide-brimmed hats, their forms jerky and unnatural. As if caught between movements, Lisa clutched his arm. "They're not alive." The tent shuddered as something brushed against it, and the smell of iron grew overpowering. Ethan unzipped the flap just enough to peer out, but what he saw made his blood freeze. Figures stood in the clearing, dozens of them. Their faces were gray and hollow, eyes sunken pits, their mouths twisted in expressions of endless labor. Each carried a phantom axe, raising and lowering it in rhythm. Though no wood split beneath their swings, at the center of the clearing stood a man taller than the rest. His chest broad, his beard matted with dark stains. He wore a foreman's coat, but his eyes glowed faintly red. And when he opened his mouth, the sound that came out was not speech, but a low roar, like fire-consuming timber. Ethan scrambled back inside. "We have to go. Now." They packed what they could and bolted from the camp, their flashlights cutting weak paths through the dark. But the forest twisted around them, trails doubling back, landmarks vanishing. No matter which way they turned, they heard the chopping. Always just behind them, always closing in. Lisa tripped over a root. Crashing to the ground, Ethan hauled her up, but when she looked back, her face drained of color. "They're following us," she whispered. He turned and saw them, dozens of phantom loggers moving in unison, their axes rising and falling though their feet made no sound, and behind them, the foreman advanced, his glowing eyes locked on Ethan and Lisa, desperate. They stumbled onto a ridge where the moonlight briefly broke through the canopy. Ethan spotted a creek below and pulled Lisa toward it. "Water spirits can't cross running water," he shouted, repeating a superstition he had once read. They slid down the slope, splashing into the icy current. For a moment, relief surged through them. The chopping stopped, and the voices faded. They collapsed on the far bank, gasping, shivering. But when Ethan looked up, his relief turned to horror. The figures stood on the opposite bank, staring silently. Then the foreman raised his axe, and the others followed. They swung downward in perfect unison. And though their blades struck nothing, the trees around Ethan and Lisa groaned. One by one, massive trunks toppled into the creek, crashing with deafening force, damming the water. The current slowed, then stilled. The foreman stepped onto the fallen trees and began to cross. Ethan and Lisa fled again, but exhaustion dragged at their bodies. Lisa stumbled, and this time she did not rise. Ethan tried to pull her up, but she screamed, clutching her leg. Something unseen had wrapped around her ankle, dragging her backward, her nails dug into the soil, leaving deep gouges as she was pulled toward the figures. "Ethan!" she cried, reaching for him. He grabbed her hand, pulling with all his strength, but the grip was too strong. One by one, phantom hands reached out, seizing her arms, her waist. Her scream tore through the night as they dragged her into their ranks. In moments she was gone, swinging an axe in unison with the rest. Her face hollow, her eyes empty. Ethan stumbled back, choking on his sobs. The foreman pointed at him, and the chopping resumed, louder than before. Ethan ran until his legs gave out, collapsing near the edge of the tract where the forest thinned. When he woke at dawn, the clearing was silent. No figures remained, only his gear lay scattered. Coated in a fine dust that smelled of rust and blood, he never returned to finish his project. When he told his professor what had happened, the man shook his head. The Bent Creek accident was one of the worst in history. A fire broke out in the logging camp. Dozens of men died, trapped by their own foreman's greed. People say he made them work past safe limits, and when the flames rose, he locked them in to finish the cut. None made it out. Ethan never spoke of Lisa again, but sometimes when he walked past the edge of Bent Creek, he swore he could hear the sound of axes in the distance, steady and relentless, as if the men never stopped working. And if you listen closely enough on a still night, you might hear another sound too. A woman's scream, echoing faintly, swallowed by the chopping that drowns out everything else. The night my uncle warned me never to step off the trail still lingers in my memory like a shadow I cannot shake. He had grown up near the base of the Blue Ridge, working the logging roads before they were paved, and he carried with him an unease about the forest that was deeper than superstition. He used to say, "The mountain is alive, and it watches. Do not wander where you do not belong, because the mountain does not forgive." I always thought he was being dramatic until the night I found out what he meant. It started as an ordinary camping trip with two of my friends, Danny and Carl. We were in college and figured a weekend under the stars would be a break from our suffocating routines. We picked a spot just off the Blue Ridge Parkway, one of those lesser-known trailheads that tourists rarely bother with. It was October, the air sharp enough to sting our lungs. The trees blazing red and orange by day, but turning into a wall of black when the sun slipped away. We carried cheap gear and enough whiskey to keep us laughing through the cold. Danny had brought his guitar, Carl had a deck of cards, and I had my uncle's old compass, though I barely thought I would need it. We pitched our tents near a clearing where the stars could push through the branches. Everything about the first few hours felt innocent, almost idyllic. We roasted hot dogs over the fire, told crude jokes, and let the warmth sink into our bones. But somewhere after midnight, when the fire had dwindled to glowing embers and the forest seemed too quiet, something shifted. At first it was a sound, faint but deliberate, twigs snapping in a slow rhythm, as though someone was circling us. Danny stopped mid-song and looked into the trees. "You hear that?" he whispered. Carl chuckled nervously. "Deer, probably. Or a raccoon," but I knew it was not. The steps were too heavy, too measured, like a person pacing just beyond the ring of light. I remembered my uncle's words, but pride kept me from speaking them aloud. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight and swept it across the tree line. Nothing. Just tangled branches and shadows that looked thicker than they should. We tried to shake it off, though sleep was hard to come by around 2 a.m. I woke to find the fire completely dead, and the woods drenched in silence so absolute it pressed against my ears. My bladder forced me out of the tent. I shuffled a few yards away, flashlight in hand, and that was when I saw it. Something pale between the trees, standing too still, too tall. At first, I thought it was a birch trunk catching the light, but then it tilted its head, a long, deliberate tilt, like a predator curious about its prey. My heart slammed into my ribs. I whispered Danny's name, then Carl's, but my voice barely carried. The thing did not move closer, but I could feel it watching. Its outline seemed wrong. Arms too long, torso narrow, legs that bent strangely. I blinked, and it slipped back into the shadows without a sound. I stumbled back to camp, shaking Danny awake. He groaned until he saw my face. "What happened?" I told them what I saw. Carl laughed at me, but it was the kind of laugh that hides fear. "Man, you were probably seeing things. Whiskey and the dark don't mix." But then Danny pointed at the ground near the fire. The dirt was disturbed, as though something had stepped close to our tents while we slept. The prints were shallow but unmistakable, long, bare feet with toes spread wider than any human's. We packed before the sun rose. None of us spoke much as we hiked back, our nerves frayed and our bodies tired. But the forest was not done with us yet. Halfway down the trail we heard a voice, It was faint, echoing through the trees, calling Danny's name at first. I thought maybe it was someone else camping nearby, but the voice was identical to mine, Danny. It crooned, soft and mocking. Danny froze, his eyes wide. That sounded like you. I shook my head violently. I did not say a word. The voice came again, closer this time, dragging my name like a lure. Carl swore under his breath and broke into a jog. We followed, stumbling over roots, ignoring the compass, ignoring the trail markers. The voice pursued us, always just behind, always shifting its tone. Sometimes it sounded like a child, sometimes like a woman, but it always called our names. By the time we burst onto the gravel road near where we had parked, the forest had gone silent again. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and I could taste blood in the back of my throat. Danny vomited in the ditch. Carl sat on the ground shaking, and none of us dared look back at the trees. We never camped together again after that. Danny dropped out of school the next semester. Carl started drinking heavier than before. As for me, I moved out of the mountains entirely, but I still wake some nights to the sound of my own voice calling me from the woods. It has been years, but I swear the forest remembers me. My uncle was right, the mountain watches, and once it notices you, it never forgets. When people ask me why I do not hike anymore, I just tell them I got bored of it. The truth is harder to explain. How do you tell someone that the forest can mimic you? That it can walk barefoot into your camp and smile without a face? How do you warn them without sounding insane? But if you ever find yourself camping off the Blue Ridge Parkway, and you hear a voice that sounds just like yours, do not answer it. Do not step off the trail. And for God's sake, do not look too long at the trees, because something in that forest is waiting for you to notice it, the same way it noticed us, and once you do, it will never let you go. The forest has a way of making you feel small, but sometimes it makes you feel watched. That is what happened to a woman named Caroline, who grew up hearing whispers about the Blue Ridge Mountains. She was a local, born and raised not far from Asheville, and she loved hiking trails most tourists never found. But one autumn evening, she took a path that she later admitted she should have left alone. Caroline had heard the story from her grandfather, who used to talk about a ridge where lantern lights flickered without a source, where people swore voices called them deeper into the trees. He said the place had no name on the maps, but hunters avoided it. They called it the hollow that answers back. Caroline always thought it was a piece of mountain folklore. Yet one October, driven by curiosity and the pull of a sunset that burned gold across the ridges, she followed a deer trail away from the main path. The deeper she went, the quieter the forest grew. It was not the peaceful quiet of dusk. It was the heavy silence of absence, as if the insects, the birds, even the breeze had gone still. She walked until she found herself in a clearing, and that was when she saw it, a lantern light bobbing between the trees. At first, she thought it was a camper, maybe another hiker. She called out. Her voice echoed strangely, bouncing back at her with a delay, almost like someone else repeating her words, but there was no reply. The lantern drifted slowly, weaving between trunks, always just far enough that she could not see who carried it. Caroline felt a strange pull in her chest. It was not fear at first, it was curiosity. She stepped toward the glow. The lantern moved away. She followed. For minutes that felt like hours, the light danced, sometimes disappearing behind branches, only to reappear further ahead. Then the whisper came. It was faint, like someone speaking into cupped hands. She froze, trying to place the direction, but the sound came from everywhere at once. It said her name, not shouted, not called. Whispered, Caroline, drawn out, fragile, but too clear to mistake. Her heart hammered. She shouted back, "Who's there?" The echo came again, but this time, it was not her own voice. It was deeper, older, carrying a rasp that did not belong to her. The lantern swayed once more. Closer now. The light flickered, and for the first time, Caroline saw more than just the glow. A shadow moved behind it, a figure, tall, too tall, shoulders that seemed crooked like branches, legs that bent strangely as it stepped. She realized then, the lantern was not being carried by a hand. It was hanging, swaying, as if tied to something that moved with the figure itself. Caroline's throat tightened. She backed away, but the clearing did not feel like the same place she had entered. Trees pressed closer, their outlines shifting. She turned to run, only to find the trail behind her gone. The forest had folded in, paths twisting in directions she did not recognize. The whisper came again, louder. "Caroline, come back." She stumbled over roots, her breath ragged. Branches clawed at her jacket. The lantern swung in her peripheral vision, always just behind her. The echo of her own footsteps seemed doubled, as though someone ran with her. Then up ahead she saw another light, fainter, steady, like the glow of a campfire. Desperate, she pushed toward it, branches snapping against her arms. When she burst into another clearing, the sight froze her blood. There was a fire, yes, but no one sat around it. The logs had burned low. Yet no heat came off the flames above it. Hanging from invisible strings were 3 more lanterns, swaying as though moved by wind that did not exist. The whispers circled her, dozens now, overlapping, each voice calling her name in slightly different tones. Her knees buckled and she clamped her hands over her ears, but the voices seemed to crawl inside her skull, then silence. When she opened her eyes, the lanterns were gone, the fire was out, the clearing lay in darkness. She could see nothing but the black silhouettes of trees. The world felt hollow, like she had stepped outside of it. Caroline did the only thing she could. She ran. She did not know how long she sprinted, but when she finally burst onto a gravel road, her lungs burned and her legs shook so violently she collapsed. A pair of hunters found her hours later, huddled against a ditch, her clothes torn, her face pale. When they asked her what had happened, she could not answer at first. Eventually she whispered, "The lanterns." Locals still talk about Caroline's story. Some say the lanterns are spirits of those who got lost long ago, calling out so they will not be forgotten. Others say they belong to something older, a presence in the Blue Ridge that wears the voices of the living to lure the curious deeper. Caroline never returned to that ridge, and even now, years later, she swears that sometimes, walking near the tree line at dusk, she hears her name whispered from far away, carried on the wind, just soft enough to make her wonder if the hollow ever let her go, because in the Blue Ridge, not every light leads you home sometimes. It leads you exactly where you should never go.